They buried him alive, and somehow, I was the only one who heard him breathing. I wasn't supposed to be outside that late, not in a house that big, not in a place where silence meant safety and questions meant trouble, but the air in the servants' quarters had felt too tight, like the walls were listening. So I stepped out into the cold night, wrapping my thin cardigan tighter around my arms as the wind moved through the estate's perfectly trimmed hedges and marble statues that watched like ghosts. The kind of place where everything looked beautiful until you stayed long. Enough to notice how quiet it really was, how controlled, how every light was placed on purpose and every shadow felt owned. And I remember thinking I'd just get some air, maybe 5 minutes, maybe less, before going back inside where people like me were expected to stay invisible, unnoticed, replaceable. But then I heard it, soft at first, so soft I thought it was just the wind pushing against the ground. A faint, uneven sound that didn't belong in a place this still, and I froze, my breath catching in my throat as I listened harder, my heart starting to beat faster not because I understood it, but because something in me did, something instinctive, something that said this wasn't nothing, that this mattered, that I couldn't just walk away. So I stepped closer, my shoes sinking slightly into the damp grass as I moved toward the far edge of the garden where the lights didn't quite reach, where the shadows were thicker, heavier, and that's when I heard it again, clearer this time. A weak, uneven tapping, like someone knocking from very far away, and my stomach dropped so fast it made me dizzy, because there was only one place that sound could be coming from, and I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to even think it, but my feet were already moving, faster now, almost running, until I reached the patch of disturbed earth near the old oak tree, the one no one ever came near, the soil darker, freshly turned, wrong in a way I couldn't ignore, and I dropped to my knees. Before I could talk myself out of it, my hands pressing into the cold dirt as that sound came again, faint, desperate, real, and suddenly I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything except dig, my fingers clawing into the soil, ignoring the sting as small rocks scraped my skin, ignoring the way my nails bent and broke as I pulled the dirt away in frantic handfuls, faster, deeper, my arms shaking, my breath coming in sharp, uneven bursts as I whispered under my breath without even realizing it. Hold on. Please, just hold on. Because now I knew. I knew there was someone under there, someone alive, someone running out of time, and the thought hit me so hard it felt like it split something open inside my chest, and I dug harder, faster, until my hands hit fabric, and my heart stopped for a second before slamming back to life, louder than anything else in the world, and I cleared the dirt away from a small shoulder. Then a face, pale under the dim light, lips parted, eyes closed, too still, and for one terrifying moment I thought I was too late, that whatever miracle I had hoped for had already slipped away, but then I saw it. The smallest movement, the faintest breath, barely there, fragile and fading, and I pulled him free with shaking hands, lifting him out of the earth like something that never should have been there in the first place, cradling him against me as the cold night air hit his skin. And I didn't think, didn't hesitate. I just pressed my hand against his chest, my other hand supporting his head, my voice breaking as I whispered, "Stay with me, please stay with me." Because in that moment nothing else existed, not the house, not the rules, not the danger I knew I was stepping into, just the boy in my arms and the impossible truth that someone had tried to erase him, and somehow, against all logic, I had been the one who heard him call from the dark. His chest barely moved, so faint I had to press my fingers harder just to feel it, and panic surged through me in a sharp, electric wave that made my hands tremble. But I forced myself to focus, forced the noise in my head to quiet because there was no time for fear, no time for anything except keeping him here, keeping him breathing, and I shifted him carefully onto the ground, brushing dirt away from his face as gently as I could, my voice shaking but steady enough to keep going. Hey, stay with me. Okay. You are okay. I have you. Even though I had no idea if he could hear me, if he could feel anything at all, but saying it made it real, made it something I could hold on to, and I tilted his head slightly, remembering the basic training videos I had watched years ago, things I never thought I would actually need, and I pressed my ear close, listening for any sign of breath, any sign of life, and for a second there was nothing, just silence, heavy and suffocating, and my heart dropped so hard it hurt. But then there it was, shallow, uneven, fragile, like it could disappear at any second, and I swallowed hard, forcing air back into my own lungs as I placed my hand over his chest again, counting silently, trying to match his rhythm, trying to will it stronger, steadier, as if I could give him something just by refusing to stop. And I rubbed his arm gently, trying to bring warmth back into skin. That felt too cold for someone who should have been safe inside, asleep in a bed, not out here under the ground where no one was supposed to find him, where no one was supposed to hear him. And that thought hit me again, sharper this time, louder, because if I had not come outside, if I had not listened, if I had ignored that sound the way I had been trained to ignore everything in this house that did not belong to me, he would still be there, and no one would know, no one would come, and something about that made my chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with anger, quiet and deep. But I pushed it down because right now he needed me, not my questions, not my thoughts, just me, and I shifted him closer, wrapping my arms around him to shield him from the wind, whispering again, softer now, more certain. You are not alone. Do you hear me? You are not alone. And his lashes fluttered, just barely, so slight I almost thought I imagined it. But then his fingers twitched against my sleeve, weak and uncertain, and a breath caught in my throat as something inside me steadied, anchored, like I had just been handed proof that this moment mattered, that he was still here, still fighting in whatever quiet way he could, and I tightened my hold just enough to keep him secure without hurting him, my eyes scanning the dark estate around us, suddenly too aware of how exposed we were, how quiet everything still was, like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting, and that was when I heard it, the distant sound of tires on gravel, low and controlled, followed by the slow approach of headlights cutting through the darkness like something deliberate, something inevitable, and my entire body went still as instinct took over again, sharper this time, colder, because I knew without being told who it had to be, who moved like that, who owned silence like it belonged to him. And I looked down at the boy in my arms, at the faint rise and fall of his chest that I had fought so hard to keep going. And for a second I did not know if I should feel relief or fear, because the man who was about to step out of that car was not someone you called for help. He was the kind of man people warned you about in whispers, the kind of man you did not survive if you made the wrong move. And yet I stayed exactly where I was, my arms wrapped around his son, my hands still trembling but unwilling to let go, because whatever happened next, whatever this meant, I already knew one thing with absolute certainty. I had crossed a line the moment I chose to dig, and there was no going back. The engine cut off before the car fully stopped, and the silence that followed felt heavier than any noise, like the entire estate had shifted its attention to this one moment. And I did not move, did not breathe any louder than I had to, my arms still wrapped around Lucas as the driver's side door opened with a soft, controlled sound. And then he stepped out, Alexander Kane, taller than I expected, broader too, dressed in a dark coat that seemed untouched by the cold, like the night itself moved around him instead of through him. And he did not rush, did not call out. He simply walked forward, each step measured, precise, until the distance between us disappeared. And for a second I thought he would look at me first, demand answers, demand anything. But he did not. His eyes went straight to the boy in my arms, and something in his face changed, not visibly, not in a way anyone else might notice, but I felt it, like the air shifted, like something controlled slipped just enough to reveal what was underneath, and he crouched down without a word, his gaze scanning Lucas with a focus so sharp it made my chest tighten. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, but carrying something that made it impossible to ignore. Is he breathing? And I nodded quickly, my voice catching as I answered. Yes, it is shallow, but he is breathing. And for a brief second his eyes lifted to mine, dark and unreadable, searching, measuring, like he was deciding something I did not understand. And then he reached out, not roughly, not carelessly, but with a controlled urgency as he placed his hand lightly against Lucas's chest, confirming what I had already felt, and I saw it then. The smallest exhale, the slightest release of tension in his shoulders, so subtle it could have been imagined, but it was real, and it stayed with me, because men like him did not show anything unless it mattered, and this mattered, more than anything else in this world he controlled, and he straightened slowly, his presence expanding again, filling the space around us as headlights from another vehicle approached and stopped behind him, doors opening, footsteps quick but cautious as two men in suits moved closer, stopping just short of us. Waiting, always waiting for him to speak, and when he did, it was calm, precise. Call the doctor, now, private line. No raised voice, no urgency in tone, but the kind of command that did not allow delay, and they moved immediately, one stepping aside to make the call while the other stood watch, his eyes scanning the perimeter, and Alexander turned back to me, really, looking at me now, taking in the dirt on my hands, the torn skin, the way I still held Lucas like I was afraid he might disappear if I let go. And there was a pause, just a second, but it stretched, filled with something I could not name, before he spoke again. Quieter this time, but somehow more intense. How did you find him? And my throat tightened, because the truth sounded impossible even to me. But I said it anyway. I heard him, and his eyes narrowed slightly, not in disbelief, but in calculation, as if that answer created more questions than it solved. And he took one step closer, close enough that I could see the fine lines of tension around his eyes, the kind that did not come from age but from control held too long. No one else did, he said, not as a question, but as a fact, and I shook my head slowly. No, no one else. And for a moment neither of us spoke, the only sound the faint movement of Lucas's breathing between us. And then Alexander made a decision. I could feel it in the way his posture shifted, in the way the space around him seemed to lock into place, and he reached down, not to take Lucas away, but to adjust the position of my arms slightly, guiding, not forcing, ensuring the boy was supported exactly how he needed, and his voice dropped just enough that it felt like it was meant only for me. Do not move. And I did not, could not, because something in the way he said it made it less like an order and more like a boundary I was not allowed to cross. And as the distant sound of sirens began to rise beyond the gates, I realized that whatever had just happened, whatever I had stepped into, it was no longer just about saving a boy in the ground. It was about the man standing in front of me, and the fact that out of everyone in this house, in this world he controlled, I had been the one who heard what no one else did, and he was not going to let that go. The sirens never entered the estate. They stopped at the gates like everything else that did not belong. And instead the doctor arrived in silence, a black sedan gliding up the gravel path as if it had always been expected, and within seconds a man in a dark coat was beside us, kneeling across from Alexander with practiced calm, his movements efficient, controlled, the kind of person who had seen too much to be surprised by anything, and I felt Alexander's hand shift slightly near Lucas, not touching me, but close enough that I was aware of it, like a boundary being drawn around all three of us, and the doctor spoke quietly. Let me take him. But Alexander did not move immediately, his eyes still on his son, still calculating something deeper than just the moment, and then finally he nodded once, sharp and final, and only then did I loosen my hold, my hands reluctant, my fingers stiff from cold and fear and something I did not want to name, as the doctor carefully lifted Lucas from my arms, supporting his head, checking his breathing again with focused precision, and I sat back on my heels, suddenly aware of everything I had been ignoring, the sting in my hands, the ache in my chest, the dirt on my clothes, the way my whole body felt like it had been running for miles even though I had not moved more than a few feet. And I watched as they placed Lucas onto a stretcher that had appeared without me noticing, like, everything here happened before you realized it was happening, and the doctor gave a quiet update. Numbers and observations I could not fully process, but Alexander listened to every word, his attention absolute, his expression unreadable again, locked back into that control I had only seen crack once. And then the doctor said something softer, something meant only for him. And I saw it again, that flicker, that almost imperceptible shift, relief mixed with something heavier, something that did not leave even when the immediate danger passed. And as they began to move Lucas toward the car, Alexander stepped aside just enough to let them pass. But his gaze followed every inch, every second, like he was anchoring himself to the fact that his son was still here, still breathing, still within reach. And then the door closed, the car pulling away into the night with the same quiet certainty it had arrived with. And the moment it disappeared beyond the gates, the silence returned, thicker. Now, heavier. And that was when everything changed, because Alexander turned back to me. Fully this time. No distraction, no divided focus, just me. And the weight of that attention settled over me in a way that made it hard to breathe. Not because he raised his voice or stepped closer too quickly, but because he did neither. He simply stood there, still and controlled, and let the silence stretch until it forced something out of me, until I felt the need to speak just to break it. But before I could, he did, his voice low, precise. You heard him under 6 feet of soil, and it was not disbelief. It was something else, something sharper, and I swallowed, my throat dry as I nodded. Yes. And his eyes held mine for a long second, searching, not for lies, but for something deeper, something that made sense of what had just happened. And when he spoke again, it was quieter, but somehow more final. No one else did. And I shook my head again, slower this time, because now I understood what he was really asking, what he was really seeing, and it was not just the event, it was me in that event, me as the only variable that did not fit. And a cold realization settled into my chest as I sat there on the ground. Because this was not over. This was not something that would be thanked and forgotten. This was something that had changed the balance of his world. And people like Alexander Kane did not ignore things that changed their world. They controlled them. They studied them. They kept them close until they understood them completely. And then he said it. Not loud, not aggressive, just certain. You are not leaving. And the words landed heavier than any command, because they were not a question, not a request. They were a decision already made, and for the first time since I stepped outside, since I heard that faint, impossible sound beneath the ground, I realized that saving Lucas had not just pulled him back from the dark, it had pulled me into something I did not yet understand, something I could not step away from, no matter how much I might want to. The words settled over me slowly, not like a shock, not like fear, but like something heavier, something that did not leave room for argument. And I stayed where I was for a second longer, my hands still pressed against the cold ground as I tried to understand what "you are not leaving" really meant when it came from a man like him. And when I finally pushed myself to stand, my legs felt unsteady, not from weakness, but from the sudden awareness that nothing about my life fit into this moment anymore. That whatever normal had been before tonight had already been buried along with that patch of earth, and I brushed my hands together instinctively, watching the dirt fall away in uneven streaks, but it did not make me feel any cleaner, did not take away the feeling that something had changed in a way I could not undo. And when I looked back up, Alexander was still watching me, not impatient, not aggressive, just waiting, like he expected me to understand without needing it explained. And that somehow made it harder, because I did not understand, not fully, and yet part of me did, enough to know that leaving was no longer an option that belonged to me. And I swallowed, forcing my voice to stay steady as I asked the only thing that felt safe to ask, is he going to be okay? And for a moment his expression did not change, still controlled, still unreadable. But then he answered, direct and certain, yes. And something in my chest loosened just enough to let me breathe again, because that had been the only thing holding everything else together, the only reason I had not completely fallen apart. And I nodded slowly, more to myself than to him. But the silence did not end there. It stretched again, and this time it felt different, less about what had happened and more about what would happen next. And he stepped closer, not invading, not overwhelming, but closing the distance just enough that I could feel the shift, could feel the weight of his attention settle more precisely, more intentionally. And when he spoke again, his voice was lower, more focused. You will stay in the East Wing. And I blinked, caught off guard not by the command itself, but by how specific it was, how already decided, like this had been arranged the moment he looked at me. And I hesitated for half a second before asking, why? Even though I knew I might not get an answer. And he held my gaze, not offended, not surprised, just measuring. And then he said it, simple, unadorned, because you heard what no one else did. And the words landed deeper than I expected, because they were not about the boy. Not entirely. They were about me, about something he had already placed value on, something I did not even understand myself. And I felt a flicker of something unfamiliar rise in my chest, not pride, not fear, something quieter, more dangerous. The feeling of being seen in a way that was not optional, And I looked away first, my eyes dropping to my hands again, still marked, still shaking slightly. And I wrapped my fingers together to steady them, to give myself something to hold on to as everything else shifted. And when I looked back up, he was already turning, already moving toward the house with that same controlled certainty, as if the conversation was finished because he had decided it was. And after a step, he paused just long enough to say, without looking back, "Someone will take you there." And then he continued walking, leaving me standing in the quiet aftermath of everything that had just happened. And within seconds one of the men approached, respectful but firm, gesturing toward the path that led to the main house. And I followed because there was nothing else to do, because staying still felt more dangerous than moving forward. And as we walked, the estate looked different now, not just large and beautiful, but structured, intentional, every detail part of something bigger that I was now inside of, whether I wanted to be or not. And when we reached the entrance, the doors opened before we even touched them, warm light spilling out into the cold night. And I stepped inside, crossing a threshold that felt invisible but absolute. And I realized with a quiet certainty that did not need to be spoken that this was not temporary. This was not a favor or a thank you. This was something else entirely, something that had already begun the moment I chose to listen instead of walk away. And now, whether I understood it or not, I was part of it. The East Wing was too quiet, not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the kind that made every small sound feel louder than it should, like the house itself was listening. And as I stepped inside, the air felt warmer, but no less controlled, every detail precise, every surface untouched, like no one truly lived here, only moved through it. And the man guiding me stopped outside a door halfway down the long hallway, opening it without a word before stepping aside. And I hesitated for just a second before walking in, my eyes adjusting to the soft lighting as I took in the room, larger than anything I had ever called mine, with clean lines, neutral colors, and a bed that looked untouched, waiting, like everything else in this place. And the door closed quietly behind me, the sound soft but final. And for a moment I just stood there, my hands still at my sides, unsure what I was supposed to do now that there was nothing urgent left to do, no life to pull back, no decision to make, just silence and space and the weight of everything that had already happened pressing down on me all at once. And I moved slowly toward the sink, turning the faucet on and watching the water run over my hands, the dirt dissolving into the drain in thin brown streams. And I flinched slightly as the sting hit, the cuts deeper than I had realized, small but sharp, reminders of how fast everything had moved, how little I had thought before acting. And I pressed my palms against the edge of the counter, breathing in and out slowly, trying to steady something inside me that had not stopped shaking since the moment I heard that first sound under the ground. And I looked up at my reflection, barely recognizing the person staring back, hair loose, clothes stained, eyes wider than they should be, like I had stepped out of one life and into another without any space in between. And the thoughts settled in quietly. This was not over, not even close, because people like Alexander Kane did not let things go unexplained, and I was now something that needed explaining. And the realization sat heavy in my chest, not fear exactly, but something close, something sharper, because I did not know what he would do with that, what he would decide once he understood whatever it was he thought he saw in me. And a soft knock broke through the silence, light but deliberate, and I turned as the door opened just enough for a woman to step in, older, composed, her movements careful but practiced, like she had been in this house long enough to understand its rules without needing them spoken. And she carried a small tray with clean cloths and a first aid kit, setting it down on the table without looking directly at me at first. And when she did, her gaze was brief but knowing, as if she had already heard enough to understand what kind of night this had been. And she gestured gently toward my hands. "You should take care of those." Her voice calm, neutral, not asking, not ordering, just stating something obvious. And I nodded slowly, moving toward her as she opened the kit, her hands steady as she cleaned the cuts with careful precision, the sting sharper now, but grounding, something real and immediate that I could focus on. And for a moment neither of us spoke, the quiet between us different from before, less heavy, more contained, until she finally said, almost softly, "He does not bring people here." And I glanced up at her, caught off guard by the statement, and she met my eyes this time. holding them just long enough to make sure I understood. Not like this. And something in her tone made it clear that this was not just about the room or the wing or the house. It was about the decision that had already been made, the one I was now living inside of. And she finished wrapping my hands, securing the bandage with a practiced ease before stepping back, her expression returning to neutral as she gathered the unused supplies. And before she left, she paused at the door, her voice quieter now. Almost a warning. Rest while you can. And then she was gone, the door closing behind her, with the same soft finality as before, and I stood there again, alone in a space that did not feel like mine, my hands wrapped, my mind still racing, and I moved slowly to sit on the edge of the bed, the mattress soft beneath me in a way that felt unfamiliar, almost unreal, and I stared ahead, trying to piece together what came next, but the only thing that felt certain was this: whatever I had stepped into tonight, whatever connection had formed between me and that boy and the man who ruled this place, it was not something that would fade by morning. It was something that had already taken hold, and whether I was ready or not, it was going to follow me into whatever came next. I did not remember falling asleep. Only the moment my eyes closed and the weight of everything finally dragged me under. But when I woke, it was not to silence. It was to light, soft and controlled, filtering through tall windows that made the room feel untouched by time. And for a second I did not move, my body still, my mind slower to catch up, until memory came back all at once, sharp and immediate, the cold ground, the sound beneath the soil, the boy in my arms, and him, and I inhaled. Slowly, steadying myself before sitting up, my hands instinctively lifting into view. The bandages clean but real, proof that none of it had been imagined, and the room looked the same as it had the night before, precise, quiet, unchanged, like nothing had happened at all, except everything had, and I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my feet touching the floor as I stood, the unfamiliar stillness pressing in again. But this time it felt different, less like shock and more like anticipation, because I knew I was not being left here to disappear, not after what had happened, not after what he had said. And as if that thought had been heard, there was a knock at the door, measured, controlled, and it opened before I could respond. The same woman from the night before stepping in, her expression composed, her posture straight, and she inclined her head slightly. "He is awake," she said, and I did not need to ask who she meant, my chest tightening before I could stop it. And I nodded once, already moving before she finished the next sentence. "He asked for you." And those words stopped me for half a second, just long enough for something inside me to shift, because it was not a command, not from Alexander, not from the house. It was from Lucas, and that felt different, quieter, but somehow stronger, and I followed her out into the hallway, my steps steady but my thoughts moving faster now, trying to understand what this meant, what he remembered, what he would say. And as we walked, the house felt more alive than it had the night before, not louder, not chaotic, but aware, like every movement had purpose. Every door opened at the right moment, every person we passed stepping aside, without needing to be told. And when we reached a different wing, one I had not seen before, the doors were already open, and I stepped inside a room filled with soft light and quiet machines, the kind that hummed gently instead of demanding attention. And my eyes found him immediately, smaller than I remembered, lying against white sheets that made his skin look less pale than it had been, his chest rising and falling more steadily now. And for a second I just stood there, the tension I had been carrying easing just enough to let something else through, something softer, something that felt dangerously close to relief. And then his eyes moved, slowly, searching, until they found me, and everything else faded. The room, the people, the quiet presence of others at the edges, none of it mattered. Just that look, confused but focused, like he recognized something without knowing why. And I took a step closer without thinking, stopping just at the edge of the bed, my voice quieter than I expected. "Hey." And his lips parted slightly. No words at first, just breath. But his hand shifted, small and unsteady, reaching just enough that I understood what he wanted, and I placed my fingers lightly in his, careful, gentle, and he held on, not tightly, not with strength, but with certainty, like he had already decided something, and I felt it then, that connection, fragile but real, built in a moment that should not have existed, and behind me, I could feel it again, that presence, that attention that never fully left, and I did not have to turn to know he was there, watching, measuring, understanding something that neither of us had said out loud yet. And for the first time since the night began, I realized that this was no longer just about what I had done. It was about what had changed, in him, in the boy, and in the space between all of us that could not go back to what it had been before. He did not say anything at first, and somehow that made his presence louder, heavier, like the entire room adjusted around him without a single word spoken, and I kept my focus on Lucas, on the small weight of his hand in mine, on the steady rhythm of his breathing that grounded me in something simple and real, because looking up meant acknowledging the other reality in the room, the one that came with control and questions and consequences, and I was not ready for that yet. But I could feel it building, feel his gaze not just on me, but through me, like he was trying to understand something that did not fit into the order of his world. And after a moment that stretched longer than it should have, Lucas's fingers tightened slightly around mine, a weak but deliberate movement, and his voice came out soft, barely more than a breath. You stayed. And the words hit somewhere deeper than I expected, because they were simple, but they carried something else, recognition, trust, something unguarded that had no place in a house like this. And I nodded gently, my voice just as quiet. Of course I stayed. And his eyes did not leave mine, as if that answer mattered more than anything else in the room. And then I heard it, a shift behind me, subtle but enough. And when I finally looked up, Alexander was closer than before, not looming, not imposing, just present in a way that made it impossible to ignore him. And his eyes moved between us, from Lucas's hand holding mine to my face. And there was something different in his expression now, not softer, not exactly, but less distant, like he was seeing a connection form in real time and deciding what it meant. And he spoke, his voice low but clear. He has not responded like this to anyone else. And I felt that weight again, not pressure, but attention, focused and deliberate. And I glanced down briefly at Lucas, then back up, unsure what to say because there was no explanation I could give that would make sense of it. And he stepped closer, stopping at the other side of the bed, his hand resting lightly near Lucas's shoulder, not touching, just there, a silent reassurance that did not need to be spoken. And for a second the three of us existed in that space without anything else, no guards, no staff, no distance, just something fragile and unspoken holding it together. And then his expression shifted again, not visibly, but enough that I felt it, like a decision being made beneath the surface, and his voice lowered slightly, meant only for me. He remembers you. And I swallowed, my chest tightening because I had not considered that, had not thought beyond keeping him alive, beyond that moment in the dark where nothing else existed. And now that it did, now that it mattered, it felt heavier, more permanent, and I nodded slowly. I remember him too. And that was the truth, not just his face, not just the moment, but the feeling of holding on to something that should have been lost, something that had fought to stay. And Alexander studied me for a second, longer, as if weighing that answer, as if measuring what it revealed. And then he turned his attention fully to Lucas, his voice softer now, controlled but different. You are safe. And Lucas's eyes shifted toward him, not with fear, not with distance, but with something quieter, something that did not fully understand but accepted the words anyway. And I realized then that this was not just about survival anymore, not just about what had almost been lost. It was about what came after, what was being rebuilt in a space that had never needed to hold anything fragile before. And I felt it again, that pull, that awareness that I was not standing on the outside of this anymore, that whatever had started in that moment under the ground had carried forward into something that now included all three of us. And when Alexander looked back at me one more time, his voice returning to that steady certainty, it was not a question, not even a command, just a statement that settled into place. Like it had always been there, you will stay with him. And I did not hesitate this time, did not question or second guess, because I already knew the answer before he said it, because Lucas's hand was still wrapped around mine, and because leaving had stopped being an option the moment I chose to listen. And now, whether I understood it or not, I was part of whatever came next. Time moved differently after that, slower in the way that made every small moment feel sharper, more defined. and I stayed beside him because there was nowhere else I was supposed to be anymore. No task waiting, no instruction to follow, just the quiet responsibility of being there. And Lucas did not let go of my hand, even as his eyes grew heavier, even as the rhythm of his breathing evened out into something closer to rest. And I adjusted my grip carefully, making sure I did not disturb him, my voice barely above a whisper as I said, "You can sleep." And he nodded just slightly, his fingers still curled around mine as if letting go was not an option he was ready to consider. And I stayed like that, still and patient, watching the rise and fall of his chest, counting it without realizing, anchoring myself to the proof that he was here, that he had made it through something he should not have had to survive. And across the room, I could feel Alexander's presence shift again, not leaving, not stepping away, but changing in a way that felt quieter, less immediate, as if he was allowing the moment to exist without interrupting it. And when I finally looked up, he was standing near the window, his back partially turned, his gaze directed outward. But I knew he was still aware of everything in the room, every movement, every breath, and the silence between us was no longer heavy, no longer pressing. It was something else now, something settled, like an agreement that had not needed to be spoken out loud. And after a while, Lucas's hand loosened slightly, not releasing completely, but enough that I could gently shift, resting his hand back against the bed while keeping my fingers close, just in case he reached again. And I sat back in the chair beside him, my body finally registering the exhaustion I had been ignoring, my shoulders dropping, my breath evening out as the adrenaline faded into something quieter, something that allowed me to think again. And that was when the reality of everything began to settle in fully, not just what had happened, but what it meant, the way the house had shifted, the way Alexander had looked at me, the way Lucas had reached for me without hesitation. And I understood then that this was not a moment that would pass, not something that would fade once he recovered. It was a line that had been crossed, one that connected all of us in a way that could not be undone. And I glanced toward Alexander again, unsure if I should speak, unsure if there was anything left to say. But he turned before I could decide, his eyes meeting mine with that same steady intensity. And for a second neither of us moved. The distance between us filled with everything that had already been said without words. And then he spoke, his voice low, controlled, but carrying something deeper than before, something that did not sound like an order. "You saved him." And I shook my head slightly, instinctive, because it did not feel like something that belonged to me. I just heard him, and his gaze did not waver, did not soften, but something in it shifted, something that felt almost like understanding. And he took a step closer, stopping just enough to keep the space between us intact. That is not something most people would have done. And I did not have an answer for that, because I had not thought about it, had not made a decision. I had just acted. And maybe that was the difference. Maybe that was what he saw. And the silence stretched again. But this time it did not feel uncertain. It felt resolved, like something had already been decided on both sides. And when he spoke again, it was quieter, but more certain than anything he had said before. "You stay here, with him." And I nodded, not because he asked, but because it was already true, already something I had chosen without realizing it. And he held my gaze for one last second before turning away, moving toward the door with the same controlled precision as always. But there was something different now, something that had not been there before, something that made the room feel less like a place of rules and more like a place where something had changed. And as the door closed behind him, leaving me alone with Lucas and the steady, quiet rhythm of his breathing, I realized that this was not the end of anything. It was the beginning, not of a story I understood, but of something that had already started the moment I refused to ignore a sound that no one else could hear. And now, whether I was ready or not, I was part of a world where silence meant control. But for the first time, someone had listened, and that had changed everything.